Shalom Ashpaka. Today I want to go over some updates for the calendar, the timelines, and the chronologies of the people and their lifespans. Let's get started. This is going to be a long video explanation. I am primarily going to be using the Masoretic, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch timelines to depict the chronologies of people's lifespans, as well as the creation to Abraham timelines. Let's get into some reading. The chronology from creation to birth of Abraham varies significantly across the three primary ancient textual traditions, the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch. These differences primarily stem from variations in begetting ages, the age of the father when the son was born, recorded in Genesis 5 and 11. The summary of the timelines. From creation to flood for the Masoretic text is 1656. Septuagint is 2262. Samaritan is 1307. Flood to Abraham, birth is 355 for the Masoretic. Septuagint is 1232. Samaritan is 1002. Total creation to Abraham for the Masoretic is 2008. Septuagint is 3494, and Samaritan is 2309. The key differences and distinctive features. The Masoretic text generally yields the shortest chronology. It is the basis for the famous Ussher chronology, which traditionally dates creation to 4004 BC. Septuagint features much longer lifespans and begetting ages, typically adding exactly 100 years to several patriarchs' ages at the birth of their sons compared to the Masoretic text. It also includes extra generations, such as a second Canaan between Ephrahaxad and Shelah. Samaritan Pentateuch presents a unique middle ground. It often aligns with Masoretics for pre-flood ages, but matches the longer Septuagint ages for many post-flood patriarchs. Some of the notable chronology variations are the pre-flood total for the Samaritan Pentateuch has the shortest interval of 1,307 years because it records lower begetting ages for Jared, Methuselah, and Lamech, causing them to die in the same year as the flood. This is very suspicious and turns to the idea that this chronology itself is a lie. Putting all three of these people to die in the same year basically is stating that editors came back through and changed this to make it more coherent with the timeline so that they all died before the flood. This is the first sign that the Samaritan Pentateuch is wrong for the chronologies. Post-flood totals. The Masoretic text records only 292 to 352 years between flood and Abraham, while the Septuagint expands this to over 1,200 years. Abraham's departure. All three texts agree Abraham was 75 when he left Haran, Mesopotamia, but they differ on Terah's age at death, 205 in the Masoretic and Septuagint versus 145 in the Samaritan Pentateuch, affecting the calculation timing of Abraham's birth relative to his father's life. I ask the question, so the Septuagint is seen as the more correct timeline. Whether the Septuagint chronology is more correct than the Masoretic text is a subject of significant scholarly debate, and there is no single consensus. Proponents of both timelines offer distinct evidence to support their preferred traditions. Arguments for the Septuagint. Ancient evidence. All reliable literary sources before AD 100 include historians like Josephus and Philo anonymously follow the longer Septuagint chronologies. Potential corruption in the Masoretic text. Some scholars argue that the Masoretic text shortened their timeline was a deliberate deflation by the 2nd century rabbis to disqualify Yahuwah as the Messiah, based on the contemporary Jewish expectations that the Messiah would appear in the 6th century, or the 6th millennia. Archaeological fit. Proponents note that the longer Septuagint timeline better aligns with known Egyptian and Sumerian historical chronologies. This is basically stating that the Septuagint allows the correct fitting of history that we have today, basically allowing the Egyptians and the Sumerians to develop themselves and start coming into fruition. Gives them time to start and spring up. New Testament usage. The New Testament author frequently quoted the Septuagint, which some interpret as an endorsement of its accuracy over the Hebrew texts of their day. Arguments for the Masoretic text. the original language. The Masoretic text is preserved in original Hebrew, whereas the Septuagint is a translation into Greek. Many scholars believe the Hebrew tradition is more likely to preserve the original numbers. Because this idea alone stands, a lot of people are falling sway. Just because it is written in square Aramaic Hebrew with vowel points, cantillation marks, and such, keeping the traditions of the Hebrew language, does not mean that the exact times were used or words were used. There are differences in the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text and the Septuagint text, all showing different things. Being that the Masoretic text came 1,000 years after the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch was even predating it as well, claiming to be 3,000 years old. Take heed not to fall sway to this ideology of choosing just because of language alone. Potential inflation and Septuagint. Critics of the Septuagint timeline suggest 100 years inflation of beginning ages was systematic correction by Greek translators to make the Bible's history appear more impressive to Hellenistic cultures. This right here is propaganda and shows a biased view towards the Septuagint. Textual conservatism. The Masoretes were historically known for their extreme precision in copying, leading many to view the Masoretic text as the most authoritative witness to the Hebrew scriptures. The Masoretes were indeed precise at copying scriptures. However, what scrolls did they choose to use after it had been 1,000 years after the fall of all the people and the Roman exile happened and the Bar Kokhba revolt? What scrolls did they choose to use? It's not about precision. It's about using the right scrolls, using the right text, the right to copy from. Internal consistencies. Statistically, analysis sometimes favor the Masoretic text, suggesting its lifespan data follows more natural patterns than the inflated figures of the Septuagint. Again, another biased view. The role of Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritan Pentateuch is often used as a tiebreaker. While it aligns with Masoretic texts for many pre-flood ages, it aligns with the Septuagint for many post-flood ages. This suggests that multiple distinct Hebrew textual traditions exist simultaneously before the Masoretic text was standardized in the 1st century AD. But since we know that in the Samaritan Pentateuch, it caused 3 people to die synchronistically in the same year, I believe that it is highly doubtful and the Samaritan Pentateuch has been altered for timelines, and it was trying to guess the correct one. Mashpaka, not one or the other is more true than it. It is a tiebreaker between all 3 to show putting together all 3 chronologies to have the correct one out of all 3. It's a puzzle, Mashpaka. We have to solve it. Again, in the Samaritan Pentateuch, the fact that the 3 patriarchs, Jared, Methuselah, and Lamech, all died in the same year is generally viewed by scholars as a deliberate textual correction to resolve a chronological conflict. Jared lived 847 years, Methuselah lived 720 years, and Lamech lived 653 years. Solving the survivor problem. The primary motivation for this adjustment was to avoid chronological absurdity found in other early traditions. For example, some early Greek Septuagint manuscripts contain data that would result in Methuselah living 14 years past the flood, even though he was not on the ark. The Samaritan scribes resolved this by ensuring the death of all non-ark passengers occurred at or before the 600th year of Noah's life, the start of the flood. Theological implications. By placing their death in the same year as the flood, the Samaritan Pentateuch implies that these 3 men were not among the righteous survivors. Not spiritual heroes. While traditions like the Masoretic text might suggest Methuselah died peacefully just before the judgment, the Samaritan Pentateuch synchronization implies they may have perished in the flood as part of the judgment on the generations. Divine timing. Some interpretations suggest this portrays Yahuwah's patience, allowing the last of the older generations to reach their appointed end exactly as the new era of Noah begins. Now, Mashpaka, I'm going to get into some statistics and analyze this information. But as of right now, the most correct one out of all three chronologies is the Septuagint. The Septuagint aligns with history that we have today from archaeological finds, as well as the languages. Egyptian and cuneiform Samaritan are the earliest writing languages that we have to date. And if we use the Septuagint, it aligns with enough amount of time for these people to arise and create their civilizations. We also have to factor in the Tower of Babel, and the separation of the earth from the supercontinent into the many lands that we have today. All of that has to take place first before these other civilizations are allowed to come into fruition. In the Septuagint tradition, the total chronology from creation to the birth of Abraham is approximately 3,394 to 3,494 years. This duration is significantly longer than the Masoretic text, primarily because the Septuagint adds roughly 100 years to the beginning age of several patriarchs. Breakdown of the timeline. The total is typically divided into two major epochs. Creation to flood is 2,242 to 2,262 years. Flood to Abraham's birth approximately 1,132 to 1,232 years. Significant factors in calculation. The second Canaan, the inclusion of an extra Canaan in the post-flood genealogy, Genesis 11, adds 130 years to the timeline. While present in most Septuagint manuscripts, the New Testament, such as Luke 3:36, which I do not use the scriptures of Luke, but it is also confirming this as well. He is absent from the Masoretic text. Also, a secondary person known as Terah's age. The total can vary by 60 years depending on whether Abraham is considered Terah's firstborn, born when Terah was 70, or later son born when Terah was 130. The manuscript variations, minor differences exist between major Septuagint manuscripts such as the Codex Alexandrinus and Vaticanus copies, leading to slight variations in the total sum. Here is the age of the Septuagint of all the people. All the way down to Abraham. Here is the Samaritan Pentateuch age. All the way down to Abraham at 175 for all three. Now, Mashpaka, this is where I'm leading to next. Based on the Septuagint, how many years have been from creation to 2026? Based on Septuagint timelines, approximately 7,571 to 7,580 years have passed from creation to the year 2026. While variations exist between specific Septuagint manuscripts, the calculation generally follows these figures. Creation date. Most scholars using the primary Septuagint manuscript place the date of creation at approximately 5,554 BCE or 5,500 BC. Here are the calculations. So, with the Septuagint timelines, total time to present time now is 7,500 something years. The Masoretic text is only 6,030 years. The Masoretes and the Hebrew people themselves are still following a 1,000 year is a day ideology. They are thinking that a day is literally 1,000 years and that we are on a 7,000 year timeline, which is not true because according to them, we would have been already 30 years within the 1,000 year reign of Yahuwah. There is no such thing, Mashpaka. They are using that verse. Those verses that say that, one of them is from 2 Peter, which is a pseudepigrapha. This isn't Peter that actually wrote the script. It is one of the New Testament books that I'm saying to eliminate. And the other one that says it is Psalms 90, verse 4. For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, are like a watch in the night. This is basically correctly explaining that this verse is included. This is explaining that a long time is very short to the Elohim, and that we ourselves are in a separate time where it seems to be very long for us. This isn't stating that we are in a 7,000 year creation to saving timeline. That is a lie, Mashpaka. Now, Mashpaka, back to the chronology timeline. The Samaritan Pentateuch approximately is 6,286 to 6,301 years have passed from creation to the year 2026. And here's its math. The Samaritan Pentateuch timeline is unique because it combines a short pre-flood period with a long post-flood period. Creation to flood, 1,307 years. This is significantly shorter than the Masoretic text, 1,656 years, and the Septuagint, 2,262 years. Flood to Abraham, 1,002 years. This is much longer than the Masoretic text, 292 to 352 years. Because the Samaritan Pentateuch, like the Septuagint, adds 100 years to the beginning age of many post-flood patriarchs. Total creation to Abraham, 2,309 years. The Samaritan Pentateuch total for this specific epoch is roughly 300 years longer than the Masoretic total of 2,008 years. Contextual variations. Different Samaritan manuscripts and historical chronologies, such as the Samaritan Joshua chronology, can lead to minor variations of a few years. Creation date of 4,263 BC, but the total remains consistently in the 6,200 to 6,300 year range when calculated to 2026. Now, Mashpaka, I'm going to go into more of the Septuagint. In the Septuagint chronology, the Great Flood occurred approximately 2,262 years after creation. Expressed as a date in BC era, the flood is typically placed around 3,298 BC. Those specific manuscripts and scholarly interpretations can place it between roughly 3,142 BC and 3,400 BC. So there are variations all over the place, Mashpaka. So it's very hard to see which ones align the most correct. We have to use what literal history that we have from calculations, from archaeological finds, and from what actually literally makes sense. So we would use the higher timelines. Variations in the Septuagint flood date, roughly 3,142 to 3,400 BCE, arise from differences between major codices and fragments in the beginning age of patriarchs like Methuselah. Now, they used the different Septuagint texts, being the Codex Vaticanus, which was the 4th century AD, and the Codex Alexandrinus, which was the 5th century AD. This was a later addition. The Vaticanus often used calculations a flood date around 3,166 BCE. It figures for the patriarch's age generally aligned with the creation date near 5,500 BCE. The Codex Alexandrinus frequently yields a slightly later date, such as 3,177 BCE. This manuscript is nearly complete and serves as a major witness for the extended Septuagint timeline. The Methuselah variations manuscripts. Some Septuagint manuscripts record Methuselah's age at the birth of his son at 167 instead of 187. These variations right here matter a lot, Mashpaka. We have to figure out which one's the most correct, which one makes the most sense. This 20-year difference shifts the flood date. If he was 167, as found in some versions, a literal calculation results in him surviving the flood by 14 years, which many scholars view as a scribal error. Historical reconstruction. Scholars like Henry B. Smith Jr. and J. Paul Tanner use primary Septuagint data to place the flood at approximately 3,298 BCE, or within the 3,300 to 3,400 BCE range. And here's its breakdowns. So we have the Vaticanus, we have the Alexandrinus, we have scholarly reconstructions, which is exactly what I'm doing right now, Mashpaka, just bear witness, and the upper scholarly range, which is 3,400 BCE. These variations depend on whether a researcher includes the second Canaan and how they interpret the age of Terah at Abraham's birth. Scholarly reconstructions of the Septuagint timeline focus on harmonizing its ancient Greek textual data with archaeological and historical findings. Two prominent models have emerged: the 3,298 BCE reconstruction and the 3,300 to 3,400 BCE upper scholarly range. The 3,298 BCE reconstruction, the ABR model. This model is primarily associated with Henry B. Smith Jr. and the Association for Biblical Research. This research argues that the Septuagint preserves the original biblical numbers, while the Masoretic text was systematically deflated after AD 70. Total years, creation to flood, 2,262 years. Key assumptions: it uses a creation date of 5,554 BCE. The second Canaan. This model includes the second Canaan, adding 130 years, which is found in most Septuagint manuscripts and New Testament. The correction of Methuselah. It argues that the 167 begetting age for Methuselah found in some manuscripts is scribal error, preferring 187 to ensure he does not survive the flood. The 3,300 to 3,400 BCE upper scholarly timeline. Scholars like J. Paul Tanner and others have explored an even broader range, placing the flood as early as 3,400 years. Now we're getting to the exact timeline, because the Egyptian and the Samaritan languages and civilizations shown to thrive around 3,300 to 3,200 BCE, so this allows time for them to spring up. The archaeological motivations. These dates are often favored because they solve major discrepancies in secular history. A 3,300 to 3,400 BCE flood date allows significant time for the Egyptian First Dynasty and the building of the pyramids to occur after the flood, which is impossible under the Masoretic text, 2,348 BCE timeline. Population and civilizations. This timeline provides more breathing room, roughly 1,000 years more than the Masoretic text, for the population to grow enough to build the Tower of Babel and the Samaritan civilization. The Terah's age, the upper range, 3,400 BCE, often hinge as calculations Abraham's birth when Terah was 130 years old, rather than 70, adding another 60 years to the post-flood total. Here are their models, the comparison of scholarly Septuagint models. On the ABR, or the Smith model, it is 5,554 BCE is the creation, and the Tanner upper range model is 5,500 BCE. The flood dates on the ABR is 3,298 roughly, and the range for the upper range is 3,300 to 3,400 BCE. Post-flood is between 1,132 to 1,232, and then the upper is for 1,232 plus years. This stuff is widely debated at this time, Mashpaka, but I believe that I have came to a conclusion about this. Both models share the belief that the longer Septuagint chronologies provided a more robust framework for early human history than the shorter Masoretic timelines. So, Mashpaka, I asked what was the maximum timeline. If we were to use the maximum ages in these models, what would the beginning of creation time be? And this was the answer. If you aggregate the maximum ages from the three traditions, primarily using the Septuagint for begetting ages and the Masoretic and Septuagint for total lifespans, the timeline extends to its furthest possible timeline. And this is the timeline that I would like to call it as well, the maximum timeline. Places the flood at 2,262 years after creation and the birth of Abraham at 3,494 years after creation. And here is its calculations. While Terah began having children at 70, the maximum chronology interval assumes Abraham was born when Terah was 130 to align with his departure from Haran at 75 upon Terah's death at 205. Summary of maximum chronology. Creation of the flood is 2,262. Flood to Abraham's birth is 1,232. And creation to Abraham is 3,494. Calculations. Upon this maximum scholarly reconstruction, which typically dates Abraham's birth to approximately 2,166 BCE, creation date is roughly 5,660 BCE, and total years to approximately 7,686 years. This timeline represents the absolute upper limit of the biblical data, incorporating the second Canaan, the higher begetting ages for the Nohor found in specific Septuagint manuscripts, and a 130-year interval for Terah. In this timeline, none survived the flood except for those that were chosen. Noah, Noah's wife, Noah's 3 sons, and 3 daughter-in-laws. In this maximum reconstruction, certain figures often thought to be alive near the flood are confirmed to have died before. Methuselah in scholarly maximum timelines, Methuselah's begetting age is 187 years, to ensure he dies in the same year the flood begins. Some outlier Septuagint manuscripts with 167 age would incorrectly show how surviving the flood by 14 years, but scholarly generally treats this as a scribal error. Lamech, Noah's father, he died several years before the flood began, approximately 5 years prior to the Masoretic text, though dates vary slightly in the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch. We're almost through, Mashpaka. In the maximum scholarly reconstruction of the Septuagint timeline, the creation date is typically placed at 5554 BCE. This date is considered the maximum because it incorporates all chronology expansions available in the Septuagint textual traditions, including the Second Canaan years and the longer post-flood intervals for patriarchs like Nahor and Terah. Breakdowns of the maximum timeline calculation: creation to flood 2,262 years, flood to Abraham's birth 1,232 years, and Abraham's birth to 2026 approximately 4,191 years, based on a traditional birth date for Abraham at 2,166 BC. Comparison with other dates: while 5,554 BC is primarily maximum date used in modern text critical reconstructions, other notable historical and manuscript-based dates include 5509 BCE, the Byzantine era, the date used by Eastern Orthodox Church and Byzantine Empire. So these were the Greeks, the Romanized Greeks, that were adopting this during the Byzantine Empire, which lasted all the way up until about 1300 AD to 1400 AD. 5500 BC, Standard Septuagint, a rounded figure often cited for general Septuagint traditions. And then the one that I have chosen, 5665 BCE. This is on creation.com, upper limit. An absolute upper limit calculated by some researchers to account for every possible textual ambiguity across all versions. Based on the 5554 BC maximum date as 2026, the world would be 7,580 years old. Now, Mashpaka, using the 5665 BC as of 2026, the world is 7,691 years old. This maximum timeline primarily follows the Septuagint tradition, which uses higher beginning ages, includes in an extra generation to calculate its significant longer pre-Abrahamic history. The maximum timeline, 5665 BC to 2026, time passed is 7,691 years. Creation to flood is 2,262 years. The flood to Abraham's birth is 1,232 years, including 130 years for the second Canaan. And here is its calculations. This places the flood at exactly 3,400 BCE. This is using a Gregorian calendar, by the way, Mashpaka. This is not using an Enoch calendar. So these dates are not biblical dates by any means. But however, they are calculated on a Gregorian calendar for this to be shown. So approximately at 3,403 BCE was the Great Flood. This would allow for the Egyptian dynasties and the Sumerians to spring up and start making their pyramids and the way that they lived, as well as the Tower of Babel and its fall when they were trying to make that happen. And there was earthquakes in the lands and separation of the people by the tongues. All this stuff happened and separated everyone. By the way, Mashpaka, this is kind of weird. I've never seen this before. Anno Moody, Year of the World. I'll have to look that up. Key distinctions of the model. The second Canaan adds exactly 130 years to the post-flood timeline. Terah's beginning age uses 130 years instead of 70 to align Abraham's departure from Haran at age 75 following Terah's death at age 205. Nahor's age uses the maximum manuscript variant of 179 years instead of the more common 79 years. So again, this chronology is using the highest known numbers that you can have, placing creation farther back. Here I'm going to show the lifespans of the people. To construct the maximum timeline beginning in 5665 BCE, we use the longest lifespans preserved in the ancient traditions, primarily Septuagint and Masoretic texts. As of 2026, this chronology places the world at 7,691 years old. In this model, the flood occurs in 3403 BCE, and Abraham was born in 2171 BCE. And this is its entire chronology of timeline and their lifespans. The antediluvian pre-flood lifespans were consistently in the 900 plus year range, with exceptions of Enoch, translated in Lamech. The sharp decline immediately following the flood, total lifespans began a rapid stair-step descent. Shem 600 years, Eber 400 and 500 years, Peleg 330 years, Terah to Abraham 175 to 200 years. The post-flood gap, because the Septuagint beginning ages are so high, often 130 plus years, the patriarchs died much sooner after their sons were born compared to the Masoretic timelines. This results in fewer generations overlapping during the post-flood era. As of right now, Mashpaka, the timeline that I accept is the maximum timeline. Its theories expand on the maximum amount of time, giving enough for our history and archaeological finds to account for things, as well as plenty of time for people to age throughout time and have things happen, things to transpire in the scriptures. This website right here, Mashpaka, creation.com, English article, Biblical Age of the Earth. This gives an entire reading of why creation is between 5,665 and 3,822, and it is a pretty lengthy read. I would suggest, if you are deep diving about this topic, give this a look over and a read, and then come over to John Pratt's website, come to this page right here, and scroll down through his models, and then begin calculating the beginning of time and find out where we are on the Enoch calendar. I hope this information has been helpful, Mashpaka. Stick with me as I begin to go down this path of finding what is the true calendar, so that we may be able to keep the appointed times and the Shabbats and correctly pin time. That is all, Mashpaka. Ahaba Shalom.